On July 7, 2015, the mutilated bodies of 4 college girls were discovered in a dormitory room at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. Thomas Reed was arrested and booked for the murders of the 4 girls, one of them being his girlfriend. What's even stranger is the story Reed told detectives about how a werewolf committed the murders. Reed was declared insane and unfit to stand trial. He currently resides in the Arizona State Hospital for the remainder of his life. He's told the same story, never deviating from it, to multiple people over the years. This is his story, as transcribed by a journalist who interviewed him in 2020. "Help me. Help me. Someone please, God help me." I screamed in my mind as my flesh was being ripped and torn apart from something I'd never seen before or believed existed, until that fateful night. I tried to move to see if I could get away, but the beast was much too big for me to even budge. This is how it's all going to end, was the final thought that ran through my mind before I blacked out from the excruciating pain. I grew up in an extremely religious household. So religious, in fact, my own mother kicked me out of the house when I was just 18 years old for dating a girl that was not a member of her church. Even with my father objecting to the fact of my sudden exodus, my staunch mother made me leave. I angrily packed up my stuff and left, never to return. Being young, I didn't have any money saved, if only a little, so I had to take the first job I could find if I wanted to eat. This was back when we had to search for jobs in the classified section of an actual physical newspaper. I scanned through the job section of the classifieds and found a job I was fairly certain I could get. It was a nighttime security job at Oak Creek Canyon near Sedona. The only problem was it was far away from where I was forced to live after my mother gave me the boot, which just so happened to be my cousin's apartment with his wife and newly born baby. I called up the company and got an interview for the following day. I went to their office around 12 p.m., and after a 10-minute interview, I had the job, which didn't surprise me as I knew how to get along well with almost anyone, even the most difficult of people. The person at the office said I was to head out to the security shack at Oak Creek Canyon the following day at 6 p.m. to be trained by the daytime security guard. As I rode home on my motorcycle, I realized the person who did the interview failed to tell me the name of the person I was going to train with. Oh well, not a big deal, I thought. The following evening came, and as I cruised along the empty country road heading towards Oak Creek Canyon, I felt an eeriness come over me, and an almost painful shiver went up my spine. I thought to myself, what the hell was that? I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the first jitters of starting a new job. As the security shack came into view, I could see the security guard who was going to train me standing out in front of the shack, smoking a cigarette. As I pulled up and turned off my motorcycle, he flipped his cigarette to the ground and said, "You must be Reed. They said you'd be coming. I hope you brought a shitload of coffee," he said with a grin. I could see he was middle-aged, and his teeth were dark yellow due to years of smoking. "Yes, sir. That's me. They didn't tell me your name, though," I replied. "My name is Frank. Come inside. This is an easy job, but there's a few things I have to show you before I take off for the day," he responded. I climbed off my motorcycle and followed him into the shack. As I walked into the shack, the putrid smell of cigarette smoke and sweat hit me in the face. I almost gagged, but held it in as best I could. It gets hot here in the summer, and I could only imagine how sweaty a person would get sitting in the shack all day. Frank turned around and said, "You'll mostly sit here in this chair, but every 2 hours, you have to get up and walk the perimeter. See this here portable clock? If you turn it around, you'll see it has a keyhole. There's places throughout the perimeter that have keys hanging from a chain on them. You have to insert the key and turn it. This indicates you've walked the perimeter, because as you turn the key, it marks the time on a piece of paper inside the clock. Now let's go walk the perimeter so I can show you where the keys are." I didn't say anything, just nodded my head that I understood. Frank turned and walked out of the shack with me in tow. We spent the next 30 minutes walking the perimeter, and Frank showed me where the keys were located and explained the ropes. As we made our way back to the shack, Frank suddenly turned and said something that left me speechless. "I'm going to give you a piece of advice, I've given every nighttime security guard, but none seem to listen, and they never seem to come back to work after. If it's a full moon, you stay inside the shack with the door closed and locked. You follow that advice, and you'll be just fine. All I could do was nod my head that I understood as we continued walking towards the shack. A lot of thoughts went through my mind, and part of me was wondering whether or not he was jerking my chain, teasing the new guy, so to speak. I've always prided myself on being able to read people like a book, but I couldn't tell this time if he was full of it or being serious. Well, I'll see you tomorrow. Remember what I said, Frank said as he lit up another cigarette and started walking towards his car. All I could do was stand there watching him as he left, not knowing what to think about what he'd said. As I walked back into the shack, the putrid smell hit me again. So the first thing was to open the 2 windows the shack had. There was no way I was going to be able to tolerate the god-awful stench. I've chewed tobacco in the past and liked it somewhat, but I've always hated cigarettes. Always gave me a pounding headache. As I was about to sit down in the chair, I could see the only chair there was the one Frank had been using. It happened to be made of vinyl, and I could see his sweat secretions on the cushions. I let out a sigh and thought this was a shitty way to start the first day at a new job. I brought some snacks and a sandwich for later, so I set them down on the desk as I proceeded to sit down in the sweat-ridden chair. As I sat down, I noticed the chair was at least comfortable. Well, that's one positive thing, I guess, I thought. I sat there for quite a while, thinking about many different things. I was still hurt and resentful that my own mother would kick me out of the house for something as foolish as dating a girl that didn't meet her so-called approval. My girlfriend was just as kind and good as most of the people that went to my mother's church. Her church was full of hypocrites that always judged everyone else, even though they're always preaching the fact not to judge others. I just shook my head and thought, I'll never understand how some people think. My thoughts then turned to what Frank had told me about not going out during a full moon. When is the next full moon? I thought, realizing I'd never really cared before now. There happened to be a calendar on the wall in the shack that had the moon cycle on the dates. I scanned it and could see the next full moon was 3 days from today. I sat back down in the chair and dozed off for a while, going in and out of sleep. After a while, I jolted myself back to reality and realized an hour and 45 minutes had passed, and it was almost time for me to walk the perimeter. The sun hadn't quite set behind the mountains, which was a good thing, being this was only my second time to walk the perimeter, and I wanted to make sure I could find all the T's during the daylight hours. I stood up, grabbed the clock, and left the shack to make my rounds. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed how eerily quiet it was and how the creek looked like glass as there was no wind. I started to whistle to myself to lighten the mood as my thoughts went back to what Frank had said as the hairs on my arms stood up. Crazy old bastard, I thought, just trying to scare me. It only took me about 20 minutes this time to walk the perimeter, being Frank wasn't there and I walked faster than he did. It was almost 9:30 p.m. when I checked my watch as I walked into the shack and flipped the light switch on. My stomach started to growl, and I decided it was time for some snacks. I also decided to set the alarm on my watch for 2 hours later, just in case I fell asleep so I wouldn't miss a perimeter walk. I never worked nights before, and I had no idea if I was going to be able to stay awake. I sat there munching on some potato chips and thought about what my girlfriend was up to at the moment. I was missing her and hoped she was missing me too. Next thing I knew, I was startled awake to the sound of the alarm going off on my watch. The bag of chips I was holding fell to the floor. Oh hell, this is going to be much harder than I thought, I said to myself. It was only 11:30 p.m. and I'd already fallen asleep. I rubbed my eyes as I stood up and grabbed the clock off the desk. I reached down and opened the desk drawer to look for a flashlight. There were several flashlights to choose from, and I chose the big black metal one, the same one police officers use. This could be used as a weapon also, I thought as I clicked it on to see if it worked. It worked, and it was very bright. The sky was clear, and it was beginning to cool down outside. The cool night air felt good as I started to walk the perimeter. I focused my thoughts on my girlfriend as I walked along, checking off each station with the turn of a key. I found each key without any problems and thought, damn, this job is going to be a breeze. The only problem is going to be staying awake. Frank was right. I needed coffee and lots of it. I'm definitely going to buy some tomorrow before I come back here, I thought. Morning finally came, and it was a pleasant sight seeing the sun crest over the mountaintops as I heard Frank's car coming down the road. I stood up, closed the windows in the shack, and tidied things up before he got there. As Frank stepped out of the car, I could see he had a cigarette in his mouth and a big cup of coffee in his hand. "How goes it, boy?" he asked. "Good, no problems." "Easy like you said," I responded. He grinned as he took a hit off the cigarette and walked towards the shack. Grabbed my stuff and stepped outside and out of his way. "Well, that's good. This job is easy. I guess I'll see you tonight. Better go home and get some sleep. Good thing you have a motorcycle, because that sure as hell will keep you awake." "See you later," he said as he closed the door to the shack. I didn't waste any time hopping on my motorcycle and getting the hell out of there. I was super sleepy and did in fact worry about falling asleep on the way home, being I had a 45-minute drive ahead of me. The next 2 days were about the same. Come to work, make small talk with Frank, and try to stay awake. I did bring a big thermos full of coffee each night, which helped, but I'd still drift off to sleep every now and then. It wasn't until the third night, the night of the full moon, my life would change forever. As I pulled up to the shack on the night of the full moon, I'd actually forgotten all about it until Frank mentioned it again. "Now remember what I said, boy. It's a full moon tonight, so I'd stay in the shack the whole night. I'll show you in the morning how to manipulate the clock so it looks like you did your rounds." "Why? What the hell happens on a full moon?" I asked him as I tried to hide the fact I was scared out of my mind. He started walking towards his car and didn't respond. He opened the door to his car and was about to sit down. He then looked back at me and said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He started up his car, lit up a cigarette, took a big drag from it, and drove off. I stood there speechless, not knowing again what to think or whether or not to believe him. What the hell could be so scary and dangerous out here? I thought. I went inside and shut the door to the shack, put my snacks, lunch and coffee on the table, then plopped down on the sweaty chair. My mind was spinning at this point. Part of me wanted to just up and quit and leave immediately. The other part of me was curious as to what he meant exactly. Part of me still believed he was just pulling my chain. Either way, I sat in that chair for a long time trying to come up with ideas of what he could possibly mean. I kept trying to figure out what a full moon would have to do with it. One thought did come to my mind as I said aloud to myself, "Nah, no way on God's green earth could that be." I wasn't sure how much time had passed as I sat there, but I looked down at my watch and could see it was past 9 p.m. and it was dark outside. It was past the time I should have walked the perimeter. I contemplated doing it, but just sat there frozen to that chair. Well, if I get in trouble, I have him to blame, I thought, because he specifically told me not to walk the perimeter. My stomach started to growl and I was getting sleepy. It was time for some snacks and my first cup of coffee. I reached into my lunchbox to grab some cheese and jerky, when all of a sudden I heard some scratching behind me, coming from outside the shack. I immediately sat up straight and froze. The hairs on my arm shot straight up. It was dead silent as I sat there with my hands still inside my lunchbox, not moving a muscle, as I could hear my heart pounding away in my chest, trying to jump out. My mind was racing as I tried to figure out what I should do next. I knew the shack door had a lock, but didn't think to lock it, and now I was cursing myself for not doing it. I decided the first thing was to lock the door as fast as I could. I whispered to myself, "On the count of 3, I'll rush over to the door and lock it. 1, 2, 3. I jumped up from the chair as fast as I could and ran over to the door. It was a deadbolt, so I flipped it as fast as I could while I kept my shoulder against the door so nothing could come inside. Once the door was locked, I slowly backed away, only looking behind me to find the chair again so I could sit down. I sat down, but not before I positioned the chair so I was facing the door, instead of it being off to my side. I sat there paralyzed with fear for what seemed like ages before my head started to bob and weave from sleepiness. I knew I'd better get some food and coffee in me before I pass out and go to sleep. No way in hell was I going to fall asleep tonight, I thought. I grabbed the cheese and jerky and poured the biggest cup of coffee I could. Halfway through my cup of coffee, and right as I was about to take another big sip, I heard the scratching again. This time it was louder and was on the opposite side of the shack, right below one of the windows. I nearly dropped my cup of coffee as I trembled in fear. I whispered to myself, "What the hell is going on? What the hell is going on?" I looked at my watch to see what time it was and prayed for morning to get here already. It was only midnight. "Shit, it's only midnight," I whispered. There was a phone in the shack, but it was only to be used in case of emergencies. And I contemplated whether or not this qualified as an emergency. What if it's just a skunk or a raccoon? I thought. They'd either laugh at me or at the very worst I'd get fired, and I needed this job. I put my hand on the phone but couldn't bring myself to lift up the receiver. "Just relax," I said to myself as I took a deep breath. It's probably just some kind of animal trying to get inside the shack to find food or shelter. No sooner had I finished my sentence, I heard something make the most hideous growl I'd ever heard in my life. That's no raccoon or skunk, and it certainly isn't any type of dog I've ever heard before, I thought. Now I was visibly shaking, and I said, "To hell with it," and picked up the phone and was about to dial 911 when something burst through the wall of the shack behind me. I tried turning around to see what it was, but all I could see was something dark that stood over 6 feet tall. It grabbed me by the shoulder, tearing into me, then dragged me out of the shack and into the darkness. I felt excruciating pain and the warmth of blood as it dragged me through the open field and into the forest. Once we reached the forest, it released its grip and walked a few feet away in front of me. It stood there looking at me. I could see it as clear as day as it stood upright in an opening big enough to allow the light of the full moon through. I lay there in horror as I could see before me what looked to be a werewolf. I was frozen in fear because it all seemed surreal, like a nightmare I was about to wake up from. I'm not sure how long it stood there looking at me before pouncing on me. I do remember it went for my neck first, ripping out a chunk of flesh and sending blood squirting out everywhere. I remember thinking, "Holy shit, I'm gonna die now." I could feel each bite as it ripped and tore at different parts of my body. I vividly remember the smell of my blood as it escaped my body. One of the last thoughts that went through my mind before I blacked out was the thought of my girlfriend. The next thing I remember was waking up to the sun hitting my face as I lay there in the forest. It took me several minutes to sit in an upright position and clear my head. The first thing I noticed was I was covered in blood from head to toe. I began to search my body looking for bite marks or pieces of flesh missing where the werewolf had torn up my body, but I could find none. There was not a mark on me to be found, only some scars from my youth. "The hell?" I said aloud. I sat there for several more minutes before trying to stand up. I tried to replay the events that took place. It seemed like one of those dreams you can vaguely remember after you wake up, but surely it had to happen because I was covered in blood and was sitting in the middle of the forest. As I stood up, I looked all around to get my bearings before deciding which way seemed like the way back to the shack. I stumbled along, trying to get the blood flowing through my legs again. My whole body was stiff. It was like I'd run a marathon yesterday, but I also felt great, like I got a huge boost of energy. As I walked along through the forest, I noticed my senses seemed heightened much more than usual, and this seemed very odd to me. My sense of smell was incredible, and my hearing was like nothing before. I could hear the ants crawling on the ground and the heartbeats of the forest animals. I could tell you the exact number of how many birds and squirrels were in the vicinity. Once I made my way into a clearing, the white shack came into view, and I could see Frank's car was not there, which was also odd because he should be working today. As I got closer to the shack, I could see the gaping hole the werewolf had made when it broke through and grabbed me. I paused there for a moment, deciding what I should do next. The only thing I could come up with was to head home. I thought about calling the police, but who would believe me? I had no proof. The blood could have come from anywhere, and for all they knew, I could have put the hole in the shack. I grabbed my stuff from the shack, hopped on my motorcycle, and took off for home. As I made my way into town, it began to hit me hard that I needed to tell someone what happened. This was not something I could keep bottled up. The first person I thought of was my girlfriend. She was in college and lived in a dorm with 3 other girls, and it happened to be on my way home. I'm not sure what time it was, but it was early, maybe 6 in the morning. My watch had been ripped off me, so I wasn't sure exactly. As I pulled up to the dorm, there were some morning joggers out for a run that passed me and gave me the strangest looks. I remembered I was covered in blood and thought I'd better clean up and change my clothes before venturing out again. Luckily, I had a key to my girlfriend's dorm, so I wouldn't have to wake anyone up. As I walked down the hallway to my girlfriend's dorm, I could see the door was ajar, and panic instantly shot through me. I knew for a fact my girlfriend and her roommates were paranoid about keeping the door locked at all times and knew something was dead wrong. I slowed down as I crept up to the door, and before I pushed the door open, the distinct metallic smell of blood hit me in the face. No, I thought. As I slowly pushed the door open, I could see blood everywhere, along with the 3 mutilated bodies of her roommates sprawled out across the living room floor. The bodies had been torn to pieces, and it was difficult to make out who was who because there were pieces of them everywhere. I hurriedly ran to my girlfriend's room, opened the door, and to my horror, there was the mutilated body of my girlfriend spread out across the bed. Her body was also shredded to pieces. I almost let out a scream of anguish, but before I could, someone spoke to me from inside the closet of my girlfriend's room. "You see, my son? This is why you can never be with someone who is not a member of our church." "She wasn't one of us," said my mother. I couldn't move as I stood there frozen in horror, realizing it was my own mother that attacked me last night, and she was the werewolf. For more chilling horror stories, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.